Welcome to those joining us in the room and online tonight for a special conference on Haredim, the draft, and the law. Where do we go from here? Tonight, we're going to discuss one of the most important issues on Israel's domestic agenda today, one with implications for Israel's national security, its internal social cohesion, its religious life, and its short and long-term politics. So I want to thank you all for taking the time to delve into this pivotal question with us. This evening is a partnership between the Israel Law and Liberty Forum and the Iyun Institute, two projects of the Cherut Center in Jerusalem. Iyun Institute focuses on the cultivation of broader civic and religious responsibility within Haredi leadership, and its publications are fostering a new discourse within Haredi society. The Forum's mission is to cultivate conservative leadership in the world of Israeli law, and to advance conservative and classical liberal legal principles through balanced, deep, and diverse debate. My name is Elana Maizel, and I am the executive director of the Forum. So, tonight, we are honored to share both an English language panel and a Hebrew language conversation assessing the issue of Haredim and the draft through a legal lens. Our first panel, which will run until 8 p.m. tonight, or 1 p.m. Eastern, including audience questions and answers, is on the topic of a conflict in context, Haredi culture, Israeli national security, and legal history. It features Professor Barak Medina, a leading constitutional scholar who served in the past as the rector of Hebrew University and the dean of Hebrew University's law faculty, and Professor Shapira, an expert in legal procedure and a host of other legal fields, who is the rector of the Paris Academic Center and was formerly the dean of Bar-Ilan University's Faculty of Law. Last but not least, we have my colleague, Rabbi Yehoshua Pfeffer, a community rabbi, jurist, and social innovator who heads the Iyun Institute and founded its journal, Tzarich Iyun. We will introduce our second conversation featuring constitutional law scholar and media personality, Professor Moshe Cohen Eliya, in more depth later tonight, starting at 8:30 p.m., 1:30 Eastern. Now we're going to set the stage for the first panel before turning to our speakers for their thoughts. Now, the goal of this conversation is to put clashing Israeli perspectives into conversation on a critical issue, which has come into sharp relief in recent months against the backdrop of the October 7th atrocities and Israel's defensive war in Gaza. Growing military threats and heartbreaking losses have contributed to an upswell in social and political ire at the mass exemptions for Haredim from the army, as well as at the subsidies granted their educational institutions. Following a court ruling at the end of March that subsidies must end to over 1,000 yeshivot, whose over 50,000 students are eligible for the draft, the government has been scrambling to come up with a law that will satisfy Haredi and other coalition partners and requirements imposed by the judicial system, not to mention Israel's growing national security needs. While the court has granted an extension of time, there is no clear solution in sight. The government put forth a legislative compromise first suggested by Benny Gantz in 2022, only to have it rejected by the Attorney General's office and by Gantz himself, claiming that the law is no longer sufficient to serve Israel's enhanced security needs. And only a few days from now, this issue will be back in court, with political discord, social unrest, and our long-term national security needs hanging in the balance. It is at such times that fuller context is needed, because this volcanic issue has very old roots. It begins in a deal struck between David Ben-Gurion and what was a small Israeli Haredi population at the founding of the state. The Haredi argument, which has remained consistent, revolves around the need for insulation from society to preserve their way of life, which they also believe contributes to the well-being of the nation of Israel. Based on authority granted in the law for defense services, the defense minister was able to exercise his discretion to exempt what was initially 400 Haredim for military service. 76 years later, that number has grown to 66,000, while the Haredi population itself is growing at a tremendous rate, now at 13.5% of Israel's population and set to hit 16% by 2030. Legal challenges have been brought against the exemption for decades, but it was only in the 1980s that the Supreme Court chose to even hear such a complaint in Ressler versus the Minister of Defense. The court ruled that the minister properly had the discretion to grant the exemption at the time. The real innovation in the case actually was an expansion of the concept of standing, allowing for more tenuously connected or even unconnected plaintiffs to bring suit on a broader array of cases, but that's for another time. Now, Ressler, who brought many cases comprising a good percentage of Israel's constitutional law books today, petitioned again in 1997. And at that point, the Supreme Court, then led by President Justice Barak, took a more active hand, ruling that the exemption had reached such a scale, at that point 28,000 people, that it must be enshrined in statutory law to be passed within 12 months. And since that point, efforts to strike a new political compromise, including through the formation of commissions, the passage of laws struck by the court on the reasoning that they violate the principle of equality, and the judicial imposition of new deadlines have often threatened to, and arguably have preoccupied and even torn apart Israel's rather fragile political coalitions. We are now over 20 years into this saga, and we've reached what may be a societal boiling point. Haredi society feels that its way of life is under threat. Large parts of Israeli society feel extorted, and the threat of political chaos once again is imminent during a sensitive, wartime environment. For the good of the country, we need to better understand the roots of this conflict and how to disentangle it in the most beneficial manner. And for that, we're going to turn to our speakers, Professor Medina, Professor Shapira, and Rabbi Pfeffer. Our speakers have been asked to focus on two questions. To what extent has the legal system played a contributing role to the situation we now find ourselves in, and what has it been? To what extent can the legal system help provide solutions now, and what would that look like? Each speaker will give an initial presentation of 9 minutes, followed by a round. We're going to try to keep them to 9 minutes, followed by a round of responses to each other lasting 4 minutes, and then a space for final comment lasting 2 minutes. You are likely to see me doing this or this during the presentations. Following the conclusion of the formal presentations, we're going to open the panel for questions from the audience. Now, for those of you here, it's pretty simple. Do this. And for those of you at home, you should have the option of inputting questions into the chat of the live stream page. So without further ado, let's start, please, with Professor Medina. And yeah, shall we?
Okay, thank you, Eliana. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. Thank you, Yehoshua and Ron. I would like to say three main things regarding the issue of exemption or recruitment of yeshiva students or ultra-Orthodox community members in general. First, I'll try to address the more sociological aspect of the issue. Then I'll delve into what Eliana has described about the legal aspects of the debate. And then I'll try to offer my insights regarding the correct solution there. But of course, this is a challenging issue. First, I would say at the outset, I believe that ultra-Orthodox yeshiva students or ultra-Orthodox in general should be subject to civic duties like any other citizens of Israel. And this includes recruitment to serve in the army. Of course, the details should be spelled out. Adjustments must be needed, but the general perspective is, as I said, and it seems to me that too often there is a mixture between the attitude that people within the ultra-Orthodox community view those who are in favor of this position and the position of those who are outside of the community. Because, in a sense, many of my colleagues and friends among the, what I would say, liberal or radical left in Israel believe that ultra-Orthodox community should be exempt from civic duties. Contrary to what is sometimes expected, liberals are against the recruitment of ultra-Orthodox, and again, of course, I'm generalizing here. And the basis of this position is not, unfortunately, I would say, but the basis is not catering for the interests of the ultra-Orthodox community. To the contrary, the basis of this position is an idea that, well, the ultra-Orthodox community in general has these values that we had better avoid integrating into our own system and into our own society. The need to accommodate their special needs would require us to pay a price in terms of our values. It would enhance positions that are unacceptable among the liberal position regarding discrimination between men and women, regarding the position towards the LGBT community, towards reforms, towards Arabs and things like that. And in this respect, those who are in favor of integration, of imposing civic duties on the ultra-Orthodox community, are ones that are against this kind of generalizations, are against this kind of an attempt to put aside, to try to shy away from the ultra-Orthodox community. And of course, this is the main issue at hand. It is not about recruitment to the army. It is about whether this is one people, one society, or is it two different societies? And I would say it bluntly. It is the question whether the ultra-Orthodox community in the Israeli society is regarded by the Jewish Zionist community as the Arab Palestinians in Israel, as a separate community that is not expected to be integrated into society, or is it one people? Is it part of the same group of society? And the issue is complicated. I'm not arguing that there is a simple solution. There are costs on each side of the sides of this dilemma, but we should be aware that this is what is at stakes, and we should also be aware of the concern that some might argue that, well, if the ultra-Orthodox community cannot be recruited into the army because they have their own values, they have their own traditions, and these kind of aspects, well, we have to resolve this issue by forcefully integrating them into society, by imposing the duty to study core curriculum, by avoiding all kinds of discrimination against women, for instance, in representation in the Knesset, in the political bodies and things like that. And the result might be counterproductive for both sides. And thus, I believe that the right solution, the right way forward is an integration, of course, one which takes into account the special needs, the special values that characterize this group. But the starting point, the basic position should be integration, equal imposition of civic duties, and then taking into account what kind of exemptions are needed and not vice versa. Now, if we look at it from the legal perspective, as we heard from Eliana, there are the main challenge here in the court imposing this duty to call for service is a debate about the very nature of a democracy. What does it mean for democracy to make decisions, for instance, in the Knesset. One position known in this field of political science as pluralism, or is a view that is very familiar in the American context. And this is a view that, well, each representative represents the interests of his or her own community. I am there to represent the interests of my constituents. And then politics is just making deals. I'll give you what is important to you, and you'll give me what's important for me. And the issue of exemption for the ultra-Orthodox community is just part of the bargaining of politics, and it has nothing to do with law. The other position, which characterizes more of the European approach, and this is the approach that characterized the Israeli decision, is that politics is about taking into account the public interest. It is the public interest that should guide the representative of each community. Of course, each representative should represent the perspective, the values, the interest of his or her constituencies, but it is not about simply bargaining. It is more than that. And the basis for the decision of the Supreme Court that the exemption to the ultra-Orthodox community is an infringement of the right to equality is all about that. Because we should be aware of the fact that this decision, that the exemption infringes upon the right to equality, is not a standard decision. Because in general, the right to equality is infringed when two characteristics or two factors exist. First, there is this unequal treatment. And here, of course, there is unequal treatment. Some people are recruited. They are required to risk their lives, to give from their time and effort and things like that, and some are exempt. So unequal treatment exists here. But in general, the idea of the right to equality also includes this element of prejudice, of discrimination against discrete and insular minority. It is the idea that the unequal treatment comes on top of some kind of prejudice against this minority in our society. And of course, here, the unequal treatment is against the majority, against those who serve in the army, and they are not subject to prejudice in general. But the idea here is that in order to decide whether this unequal treatment should be considered an infringement of the right to equality, must take into account what is the purpose of this unequal treatment. And the court ruled as it ruled because of the position that this unequal treatment is not based on a position that we aim at promoting equality or to cater for a legitimate interest, as in the case, for instance, of affirmative action. But the idea here is that we want to do that in order to cater for the specific private interests of a specific community. And the court viewed this as illegitimate. Of course, the fact that the right to equality is infringed does not mean that is necessarily illegal. There is a distinction between infringement of a right and a violation of it. Because if there is an infringement, we have to consider all relevant factors and decide whether the infringement is justified or not. I do not have the time for that. I already ran out of time, but I'll say just in a sentence that, of course, there are two basic interests of the ultra-Orthodox community in this kind of unequal treatment. First, the interest in preserving the community. The concern is that if yeshiva students or other members of the community would serve in the army, they would be exposed to general values, to other people. There is a risk of secularization or risk of losing our values. And I think this interest is insufficient to justify the general exemption. The other issue is, of course, the value of studying Torah and studying in yeshiva and all these kind of aspects. And again, this is a legitimate interest that should be taken into account, but it cannot justify this complete blanket exemption for service. It must be based on a more nuanced approach, taking into account the interest both in equal treatment to all members of society, the needs, the urgent needs of Israel following the events that we are experiencing now in a greater number of people serving in the army. And the result is that while it is permissible to exempt a certain number, a small number of yeshiva students, it cannot be justified to exempt all those who study in yeshiva, or almost all of them. So thank you, and we will be able to elaborate more in a second. Thank you so much. Thanks. Sorry.
You want a quick response? No? Okay. You're the chair. Okay. I have an even smaller note. So. Okay, so let me begin just with a quick reservation from the introduction made by the chair. You mentioned in the introduction that there are 13.5% of the population that are Haredi. You rely, of course, on the data of the Central Bureau of Statistics. And I think that this data is not accurate. I think that the more accurate data is the one that has been gathered more thoroughly, I think, by the Haredi Institute for Public Affairs. I believe that this is the correct translation of its name. I think it's more around 12%. But the reason that I refer to this is that I think that this whole discussion is made under the shadow of the mass panic from the demographic demon. There are three assumptions there. One, that as of now we're on 13.5% of the Haredi communities within the population. The other is that the growth rate would remain pretty much constant because the Central Bureau of Statistics, they have three fabric scenarios. They call it the maximal, the minimal, and the intermediate. And they're all based on the current growth rate. They do. They take it and they go up and down. And what they don't do, if you want to extrapolate a function, what you should do, I think, is do at least the first steps of developing the Taylor series. You should think of the derivative, the growth rate, and then of the second derivative, the change of the growth rate, and so forth. They don't do this systematically. If you take into account only the second derivative, I think that you'd end up with much lower numbers, even on 2030, as you mentioned, not to say 2065, which is the forecast of the Central Bureau of Statistics. And then there's also an assumption that the Haredi lifestyle would remain fixed through the changes in its share of the population, which is very dubious, I think. It's true that nowadays the Haredi communities can afford enjoying living on welfare, let's call it very bluntly, and being exempt from military service. I'm not sure that they will be able to enjoy these benefits should they become a much larger minority. Historically, by the way, at least the Haredi communities in Jerusalem, I might add, many of my own family are from this community, lived on charity or philanthropy for 3 centuries. So it used to be the case for quite a time, even before the establishment of the State of Israel, but they were very small communities relative to the Jewish people. Even in New York and New Jersey and Maryland, I also have family there. They rely on welfare, let's admit it, much more than the general population there. But then the moment that the minorities grow, the ability to rely on welfare payments is lessened. Okay, so this is just a quick reservation.
Out of the 9 minutes.
Okay. Now, as to the main issue, the political and the legal situation. The reason that the Haredim are exempt from service is that the rest 87% of the population allow them. Let's begin with this. No one has ever even mentioned a constitutional protection of the right not to serve in the army. A simple majority decision would have changed this at any time, at any moment, today and within the last 76 years. So it's not as though when people say that it's not democratic, it's not as though they enforced. Okay, it's not as though they enforced this privileges by brute force, like the Alawi minority in Syria. They took advantage of their position and within the political structure, and to be more exact, they took advantage of the fact that for the rest of the 87%, it was much less important for them to serve than the question which secular or which non-Haredic would rule. That's it. So, in fact, what we're dealing with is the question whether religious minority can take advantage of their ability to cast all their voting rights on a single issue. And as Professor Medina justifiably describes it, it's a matter of our conception of democracy, whether it's the arena where interest group collide, or whether we can put in some external or transcendental view of the common good or the general public interest. Professor Medina says that it's a European consumption. I should add that in continental Europe, this Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a type of democracy, has been exploited during at least the 19th and the 20th century. So the question boils down to this: what's our perception of democracy, and whether constitutional law can protect the majority from itself, whether a constitutional law is aimed at protecting the majority from a situation where the minority would take advantage of its different set of priorities and of being a single issue, a secluded sector. I'll end with this, and as we said, if we have more time, I'll elaborate.
Well, first of all, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Elena. And thank you to my dear colleagues, to Barak, to Ron. Great pleasure to be able to address everybody here and those at home, of course. Okay. Just want to point out, we're discussing the Haredi draft, and right now, as we speak, I ought to be elsewhere. There's right now a funeral taking place for a young boy, 20 years old, who was part of Netzach Yehuda, part of the Haredi battalion in Kfir, who was mortally wounded a few days ago and died today. May his memory be a blessing. And just goes to show how nuanced and complex the issue is. Now, I'd like to address the issue that I was asked to address, which is the place of the law in the issue of the Haredi draft. And I'd like to argue there's some place for the law. And I'd also like to argue that the dominance of the law, the dominance of Supreme Court intervention, can also be deeply damaging. So I'll start with this. In my experience at Hebrew University included a wide array of new exposures. I wasn't used to the kind of dynamic and the kind of atmosphere and events that took place on university campus. And one of them was a conference with Knesset member Moshe Gafni. Never seen him before, literally. And he came to Hebrew U, and I was finally able to meet Moshe Gafni face to face. And Gafni spoke about the Supreme Court and its attitude towards the Haredim, the Haredim. And he said, his words, there's never been a single, not one, Supreme Court decision that has favored the Haredim. Not one decision. I'm not going to argue the point now. It's not an accurate statement, but it's certainly a perception which is commonly held among Haredi society and also outside of it. And why? Why is this the case? So there's a paper that became a book by somebody called a professor in Israel called Moshe Cohen. And he presents two different theories or understandings of why there are so many Supreme Court decisions that are perceived to be anti-Haredi. I could list you a whole bunch very quickly. It's not just about the draft. It's about kosher food, and it's about funding for schools, and it's about the authority of the rabbinic courts, and many other potential issues. And the question is why? And he says, well, I have two theories, okay? One theory, he says, is because of ideology. It's all about substance. It's about ideology. And he says, well, listen, we know that here in Israel, there's something of a public conflict in terms of ideologies between those who uphold the liberal values of individualism, of autonomy, and generally speaking, of liberal values, humanism, secular humanism, versus the Haredim, who uphold different types of values. Those values are more duty-oriented than freedom-oriented. They're more community-oriented, public-oriented than individual orientation. And they're more God-centered than secular humanism-centered. And there's a clash between them. And as Shuki Segev has said, the Supreme Court has kind of self-defined itself as a spiritual shepherd of Israeli society, where the place where ideological disputes are settled, and the court sides with the liberals. And that's the ideological understanding of why decisions are perceived to go against the Haredim. Of course, this is very damaging. It's damaging. The perception is very damaging. Number one, because I would say the most important thing is that it very much undermines trust in the Supreme Court. The Haredim, latest figures that I've seen, this is from 23. The level of trust in the Supreme Court stands at 6%. 6%. I was surprised. It's 6%. That's not good, right? The court needs to enjoy public trust. It's not good. But there's other issues also. There's the thorny issue of enforcing liberal standards on non-liberal minorities. It's a thorny issue. There's an issue of, as it were, allowing those who win in the court to be radicalized, because even if they play their hand too far, they can rely on the courts to back them up. So things will be okay. That's one interpretation, ideological. There's a second interpretation, which is institutional. And this speaks a little bit to my colleagues before. And this is based on public choice theory or interest group theory. And that says, well, the Supreme Court has a certain job or a role of correcting potential, quote unquote, market failures of Israel's democratic system, where a minority can have a lot of power, right? The Haredim, they're happy to do whatever everybody else wants on 95% of issues, but there's 5% of issues where they're very staunch in what they want. So the draft is an example. Funding for educational institutions is another example. Shabbat might be a third example. But there's very few, a small set of issues where the Haredim they're die-harders. Okay, this is what we want. Everything else, whatever you guys say. So it makes them into very convenient coalition partners. But it makes certain issues very entrenched, because the Haredim are die-harders on those issues. And that's a kind of market failure. Or is it, right? Is that just democracy? Or is that a kind of market failure of democracy? So says Cohen, well, what the court can do on this is at the very least to expose the procedure, to ensure that it's transparent. And I think that could be very much the case for the first decision that was made concerning the draft. This is the 1997 or 98 decision, Ressler, where the court didn't weigh in on whether it's good or bad, legitimate, illegitimate, legal, illegal, that Haredim should be exempt. What the court said was that it's not okay for this to be done under the shadows of the defense minister's annual exemption. The defense minister said, because then you can hide behind professional considerations. You can hide behind, well, it's the defense minister. This has to be enshrined in law as a matter of proper procedure. And that's Thank you. I hand it back. And that, we could argue, is a matter of public procedure. It's a matter of interest groups. It's legit. However, in the later decisions of the Supreme Court, and I'm speaking about the 2012 decision, the 2017 decision, the 2006 decision, all of those decisions went in a different direction. They went not strictly, but they went ideological. I'll give you a quote. This is from the 2017 decision, and it echoed the 2012 decision, striking Israel's law. Israel managed to put together a law with great difficulty, and it was struck by the Supreme Court basically because of the lack of equality. And I quote here from Solberg, who was the only dissenter in the 2017 decision. And he says, as I read the opinions of my colleague, the president, and the additional comments made by my fellow justices, it seems clear that beneath the veneer of formal lacunae in the law and factual figures is a decision that's based on ideology and values. And Solberg, I yearn, he says, for a healthy balance between the values, competing values of Torah study on the one hand and the joint sharing of the social burden. However, he says, this cannot begin and cannot end with the law. And I quote from Justice Elena Kagan, United States Supreme Court Justice, actually a very good friend of Scalia. And I think that even though she's an Obama appointment, but her words here very much reflect, or at the very least, could have been said by Scalia, and she says, the very worst moments for the court have been times when judges have essentially reflected one party's or one ideology's set of views in their legal decisions. They just can't and shouldn't happen. And she goes on, I'll for love of brevity, I'll skip. But I will say the following. I think that over here at stake is much more than the issue of trust in the court. At stake over here is the basic issue of what's this all about. And in this, I'll concur with a statement that was made by my friend Barak. Later I'll dissent, but at this stage I'll concur. And I'll say the following. The Supreme Court decisions that focus on equality make it sound like the question that we need to face, the big question of Haredi service in the IDF, is a question of equality. Will we comply with the equality value, which is an abstract, liberal leaning, and very binary value, equality? Will we comply with equality or not? But the true issue is entirely different, and it's the following. The question is, will Haredi society internalize its part in the incredible story of the Jewish return to its ancestral homeland and the shared responsibilities, both religious and civic, that emerge from this recognition? Will we see everyone else living here in Israel as brothers, as achim, and therefore live up to the scriptural demand of Ha'achechem yavo b'milchama? Will your brothers come forth to war? V'atem tishvu po? Will we think of that? Will we accept that as a moral claim? Will we make the necessary efforts to ensure that Haredim can serve in the IDF while maintaining their core values and way of life? And of course, will we have partners, right, the army, broader Israeli society, that will be ready for this participation, including a range of concessions that are not easy to make? And these questions, right, alongside the distinction between those who are fully immersed in Torah study and those who are not studying Torah, and there are thousands of Haredim who are not studying Torah, young Haredim too, those distinctions are not legal distinctions. They're social, they're communal, they're ideological, they depend on sweeping trends, they depend on brave leadership, they depend on profound processes that are ongoing. They're not matters that can be forged but by the strike of a judicial hammer. They're very different. And I'll end. I know Elena is staring. I'm going to end. There's an article that was penned on Iyun by myself. I wrote it. But this was a response, okay? That was in the response part of the articles. And the responder is a woman. I don't know who she is. But she asked for this response to be aired. And I'd like to read part of it just to emphasize the points. She writes like this. She says, I'm an observant woman. My husband is in the reserves. He didn't have to enlist. His division was disbanded last year. He's 40. But on Simchat Torah, he realized there was no way he could continue life as normal, even as the Jewish people faced mortal danger. He fought to return to the army, and he's been for several months in reserve without coming home. She says, I believe there should be a percentage of Haredi Jews who continue to study Torah and not enlist, but only a certain percentage, those who are dying in the tents of Torah, those who are fully immersed. That's our division of Torah scholars. But everyone else, they should be enlisting in the army. We need you. Our soldiers are tired, worn out. We have a long way to go. My husband's battalion commander told his troops, we're fighting on 9 fronts simultaneously. If the lifestyle is not suitable, we'll find the solutions. Will you give up another mitzvah because it's hard to find a solution? And these words, she says, draw from the depth of my heart, and I pray that they'll also enter into your hearts. And I found the plea moving. It doesn't draw from elusive and absolute values of equality or any other. It respects Torah students. It's ready to exempt them from conscription. It doesn't it doesn't ooze contempt. It's formulated with respect, with sympathy. It's not a matter of complex legal reasoning. These arguments are simple. They're too simple to need to go to the court for these arguments. They need to be discussed within Israeli society. They need to draw from within Haredi society. They shouldn't be coming from the outside. They shouldn't be coming from the court. We owe it to ourselves to bring up these arguments, to raise them, and to ensure that they're heard, not only in the Knesset, but in broader Israeli society. We owe it to ourselves to ensure that changes that are required happen, and they shouldn't be interacting with the potentially damaging discourse that comes from the Supreme Court. Thank you.
Testing. Okay. Thank you for that double presentation, Rabbi. What I think we're going to do now. No, I know you should never try to get between, a rabbi and the end of the sermon. Okay, my suggestion, resolution, is that we go for the 4-minute responses. We'll skip the final comment and go straight to questions and answers. And why don't we start again with Professor Medina? The button is this line. You just press it for a longer period of time. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I'll say 3 things. First, I think it's wrong to describe the Supreme Court as acting against the ultra-Orthodox community. It comes from ignorance. Just consider 2 simple solutions that are at the heart of what it means of the debate. One issue is that of core curriculum. The court rejected the petition to require ultra-Orthodox students, kids, to study core curriculum or to deny them the benefits, the support from the government. The court rejected petition to impose on religious parties, on ultra-Orthodox party, to enable women to be part of representatives or candidates for mayors, for city councils, for the Knesset, and things like that. The court rejected these petitions, and the idea that there is no single decision in favor of ultra-Orthodox community, this is just simple examples, is simply wrong. Second, the idea of ideology. It's always puzzling me, and again, I'm not arguing with Yehoshua here, that the idea, for instance, we are sitting here in a meeting that is sponsored by the Law and Liberty Forum. The idea of liberty is about values. Liberty is another value, and it's puzzling how come that those who are in favor of this kind of value, for instance, liberty, are against the idea that courts would employ values there. And I think that it's inevitable that court decision will incorporate ideological values. And in response to what Yehoshua said about the fact that only 6% of the ultra-Orthodox community have trust in the Supreme Court, which is of course troubling, I can say that the same poll showed that 90% of ultra-Orthodox said that they believe that the state of Israel should discriminate against non-Jews in Israel. The Israeli government should favor Jews over Arabs in Israel. Now, I think there is correlation between the two numbers there. This very low level of trust in the Supreme Court is correlated with the rejection of the idea of equality. And the question is, what should be done? Of course, it is troubling, but I'm not sure that the trouble should come for the first number rather than from the second number. And this brings me to the last point that I would say, and this has to do with the power of the court. And we know that there is this idea of hollow hope, that the court cannot bring about a change in public perception. You cannot impose on a group that 90% of it rejects the idea of equality, that is in favor of discrimination in various aspects, your own ideology just by fiat, by force, because you have the power, and you cannot change perspectives regarding the service in the army and things like that, or the draft. But I believe that the court does play an important role here. And it is wrong to view this issue as a dichotomy, whether either this exemption is permitted or any exemption is impermissible. In fact, what we see and what I believe is the right interpretation of what the court is doing, the court is against the idea of giving this exemption just as a result of exploitation of political power. If there is sufficient majority in the Knesset that includes both coalition members and opposition members, that there is this conviction that, well, this is a compromise between conflicting views, the court would accept this infringement of equality. The concern is that this kind of laws that give this blanket exemption is not the result of rational decision-making, taking into account all relevant considerations. At the end of the day, the idea that it is the court to be blamed, I think is the wrong one. The court would not have the political power to enforce this kind of a decision had the majority in Israel not being in favor of this kind of approach by the court. We see in all those polls that a very high majority within the Israeli society and specifically within the Jewish society is against this exemption. And there are demonstrations, there is a growing discomfort and I think even hatred toward the ultra-Orthodox community because of this approach. And I think that it would be wrong to assume that if we had gone away with this judicial review issue, well, we could go away with our lives without any trouble. I think it's the opposite. I think that the solution should be by, and just as Yehoshua said, with an open discussion, with a willingness to compromise from both sides, both in terms of the numbers of the quotas, and also in terms of the accommodations that are needed in order to enable the ultra-Orthodox to be drafted. Yeah, thank you.
I'm just going to invite the crowd online, if they want to be officially invited to start asking questions, then please let us know, because after we finish this round, we're going to start doing questions with the audience.
Okay, so just to some of the points. First, we should distinguish the institutional problem and the value judgment in itself. I truly sympathize with what both the other presentations presented as a sense of solidarity and wish that the Haredi community would become a full partner to the rest of at least the Jewish people or the Jewish citizens of Israel. But here the question is legal, formal, even procedural, and institutional. And this is a totally different issue. The question of whether the Supreme Court should impose a division of labor where one issue, which is law and religion or exemption of from conscription, would be decided in one institution, whereas other issues such as peace agreements with the neighbors would be decided in a different institution, the parliament or the Knesset. This is a different issue, and I think it's a problem. The reason that it's a problem is that if you divide value decisions by institutions, you thwart any possibility of trading among values. If I want to trade my view on state and religion in exchange for your view on the question, I don't know, of the borders of the state of Israel, I can't do it if one institution decides one type of questions and another state institution decides another types of decisions. And this is a major flaw in a democratic system, because the whole purpose of democracy is to enable this trade-off of values. So here is where I see the problem. Now, I mention the political, I'd say even opportunistic aspect of this of the secular concession towards the Haredi communities. But there's also a non-opportunistic aspect of this, and this is a true appreciation of the cultural role of the Haredi community to the culture of Israel. The Haredim are truly appreciated by many non-Haredim who enlist as a condensed capsule of authentic Jewish identity. It doesn't necessarily justify their exemption from being enlisted. I would have liked them to serve in the army like my children do, but this is one of the reasons that the 87% of the population, as I mentioned before, allowed this not as a product of an incidental exploitation of a particular political setup, but consecutively within 76 years and 37 governments. You can calculate that the government in Israel, the span life of a government is exactly 2 years in Israel, and so this is not an incidence of a one-time trick. It's the true decision of the majority throughout all the years when the state of Israel exists.
4 minutes. Okay, 4 minutes.
I should have given him 2, that way.
No, I'll be very brief. So a few very quick points. First of all, I want to relate to the point that was brought up by Barak about, do liberals want Haredim within Israeli society, in the army, in the institutions, or don't them? And I feel that sometimes there's a certain double speak going on, pardon the word, from liberal parts of Israeli society, and many parts, I don't mean specifically the radical left or any specific area, that on the one hand wants the Haredim to be a part of the workforce, of the army, of the institutions, and because we need them. Well, of course we need Haredim in the IDF. Post October 7th, I don't think anybody will say, well, we can do without them. Of course we need. But the invitation is not always sincere. It's an invitation, please join us. However, join us on our terms, meaning join us, but don't join us as full partners in the deliberation, in the conversation, in the who gets to decide the nature of the public sphere in Israel. And if the invitation is insincere in that sense, the Haredim have very good senses. They pick it up. And they pick it up also because of different, there was a program for integrating Haredim into the public sector positions. And there was it was a very good program. It worked really well. It was cancelled after 1 year. Why was it cancelled? Because it was done separately for men and women, and there was a petition to the court, and it was cancelled. and shame, because it indicates that the invitation is insincere, meaning please join us, but on our terms. And that needs to be sorted out. It's a thorny issue. It's not simple. That's one point. Another two very, very brief points. They both relate to the question of equality. So first of all, 90%, Barak mentioned, of Haredim said there shouldn't be equality between Jews and non-Jews. But I wonder in which context that was said, because, you know, perhaps in the context of funding Torah study versus funding the equivalent in the Muslims. I don't know if the context was a question of basic human rights, and I hope it wasn't. And if it was, then these are factors of our lived experience. So long as there'll be greater volumes of Haredim in the workforce, in the army, in wherever it is, like fighting side by side with somebody who is maybe Druze or somebody else, then that's what builds this sense of trust and this sense of togetherness. And this is a factor of experience. It's a package deal. This is something that can't be dealt with on an individual levels. It's a whole package of being a part of Israel and appreciating those who you serve shoulder to shoulder with. And finally, on the question of equality in this particular context, and as Barak mentioned, this is a very unusual type of equality. This was mentioned by some of the Supreme Court justices, most predominantly Gronis, who was the president of the court in one of the decisions, and today Solberg. And yes, it's equality, or it's inequality, but it's non-discriminatory inequality. And this makes it much less of an issue of protection of rights. This is not, well, we're trampling somebody's rights. It's much more a question of an abstract notion of equality. And I think, therefore, if we have a large majority of people who wish Haredim to be a part of the IDF, well, if they care about it enough, and I think that today they probably do, then that should come to bear. That should be expressed at the ballot boxes. And by the way, I think it will be. And the very threat that it will be is also pressuring the Haredi today to make much greater concessions than ever before. And like my colleague Ron mentioned, in the past 76 years, there's been an agreement, 87% agreed, or a large part of. Well, I don't think that's necessarily going to be the case in the future. And that is what's going to make the ultimate difference in this issue. How was that?
That was amazing. It was on time. That was on time. Okay, so first, I'm going to just say a mini thank you. I'm going to say a larger one at the end of the event. To all of our speakers, this is a very important conversation. It's not usually conducted in such a diverse and, I'd say, intellectually rich way, and we're very appreciative. And amicable. Except you and I are going to have words later about that 15 minutes. But so I'd like to turn now to questions. We have a microphone that will circulate, and I'll also read out any questions that we get from online. Okay. So. Yeah, and please direct it to a speaker, or if you'd like, to all three.
My name is Shlomo Gewurtz. Rabbi Pfeffer, forgive me if I seem to be oversimplifying your position, but it seemed from your presentation at the lectern that you asked Israeli society pretty much to avoid the courts on these questions and rely instead on an internal evolution within Haredi society to see the light and understand the supreme value of Ahavat Yisrael. It sounds nice, but where is this coming from? Where are the Rav Kookieans in the Haredi society? Where are the children who are learning how to sing Hatikvah? Where is this hope and optimism that Haredi society will embrace Ahavat Yisrael as its supreme value?
That's a big question, Shlomo, but thank you for it. What I would say is, again, I'm not just being naive and saying, let's just rely on the goodwill of the Haredim who are going to come and say, or knock on the army's door and say, please let us in. We'd like to serve in the IDF. That would be overly naive. And therefore, the point I was trying to make was that the kind of discourse that takes place in the court isn't necessarily, or is necessarily not, the type of discourse that will inspire, the type of discourse that will make a change internally in an educational way, in a process way, in a way that will lead to healthy change. I think that can happen more from the kind of calls that I read out from the blog, from the response. And that kind of response shouldn't be limited to a Tzarech Iyun article. It should be in the Knesset, it should be in the public discourse, it should be a part of the ballot boxes. And of course that will exert legitimate democratic pressure on the Haredim to change. But your question really wasn't that. Your question was internally, what's going on in Haredi society? And the answer is there's a lot of grassroots movement taking place in Haredi society today. I'm not saying that it's overnight change, but I am saying that there's definitely a lot of movement towards a greater recognition. I went to different army bases to give shiurim, to give Torah classes to different groups of Shlav Bet. Shlav Bet is a way for older individuals to participate in army service. It's a 2-week or 1 month regular service, and then reserve duty. And the reserve duty can be very meaningful, reserve duty. And so I gave shiurim in these different army bases in Haifa, in Irabadim, in the south, in different places. And afterwards, I always spoke to people and I asked them, why are you here? And 2 answers, and they're both great. One answer, we're here because we feel that we're a part of it. Anachnu chelek me'asipor. We're a part of the story and we can't sit by and not join. Number 1. Answer number 2, we're here because we want to go back to Bnei Barak with uniform and for our neighbors in Bnei Barak to see that it's not a contradiction, that you can be in the army and be Haredi and it's not a contradiction. Are the numbers huge? No, but are these processes meaningful? Do they make a change in the mindset? Absolutely. And that's taking place in army terms, in education terms, in terms of joining the workforce, but more broadly, in terms of just being a part, that we're a part of Israel and we have responsibility for it. You're right, it's not coming top down. It's coming from grassroots, it's coming from the field. But God willing, it's a process and it's taking place.
Can you describe their demography? I mean, age, Sephardim or Ashkenazim, to what extent are they really Haredic in the usual sense?
Yeah, but it's a long story. The Shlav Bet people, I'll just mention, were not everyone, but a lot of them were like the real, like hardcore, real Haredim. The people coming to Netzach Yehuda, the guy whose funeral is taking place now, like regular, Haredi family from Ramot, neighbors of mine. But yeah, it's complex. The exact demography and so on is for the next conference.
You equated, you used the concept of welfare, equating Haredim in America and Haredim in Israel. America has separation of church and state, it's welfare. Israel has a Knesset. The money that the Haredim get for them, and remember, the welfare that the Americans get are available to every American, based on income, based on whatever. Israel, the welfare that you refer to, I suggest to you it's not welfare, it's legislated. It's money that is given to the yeshivot, etc., through the democratic process, I submit. There's a Knesset, the Knesset votes. And that leads me to my second point, and I grant you it's a confusing point for me, always has been, in the definition of democracy. The State of Israel, when it was founded, enacted a giyus, a universal draft. I assume a majority of the Knesset members, I'm not sure that all of them, voted for the universal draft. So that's that becomes democracy, right? Why is that democracy? There is a minority who say, the Arabs, the Haredim, we don't want any part of that. What defines democracy in terms of making such a decision? In other words, we throw around the word democracy all the time. I practiced law in Canada for several years. I grew up in Canada, heard the word democracy maybe once every 5 years. You turn on the news here, you hear the word democracy every day 7 times. So what I'm asking is, why is a universal draft democracy as enacted by a majority?
Well, there are, of course, various conceptions of democracy. In my mind, democracy is the rule of the majority, excluding all types of decisions that you wouldn't have accepted behind a veil of ignorance. That is, that are non-opportunistic decisions. If you know in advance that a general rule would work in your favor, then accepting it by a simple majority is undemocratic. But if it's universal in the sense that you would have accepted it behind the veil of ignorance, then it's democratic enough. Now let's go to this question of the application of this term equality. Equality is a notoriously vague concept. Why is it unequal to say that the study of Torah is not a equivalent or a fair substitute for military service? I mean, Barak Medina can get exemption from the army. All he has to do is to join the yeshiva. What's the problem? He's as equal as anyone else. So it's not really a matter of equality. It's a matter of preference of one value to another. Sure.
Enacted by the Knesset, or they tried to enact it several times. Our court turned it down based on, as Professor Medina said, lack of equality or whatever. But I go back to my point. Majority enacts a giyus. Majority says that Haredim, a majority of the Knesset, says Haredim are exempt. Mm-hmm. Suddenly, there's another body, the court, which I'm not suggesting for a moment that we don't need the court, don't get me wrong. But the court says, well, that's not equality. But universal draft is equality because the majority says it was. I think we simplify these concepts to the point where they just become words. It's just another set of words. This is equality, that's not equality. That's my point.
Yeah, I think that, you know, that to my view, it is wrong to describe the issue as the court decides what type of draft policy is permissible and what isn't. The court does not require universal draft. The court does not require anything in this respect. What the court requires is that the decision would be based on substance, that the Knesset members would take into account all relevant considerations. What is required is that a majority among the Knesset that is not influenced only by the need to cater for the interest of the Haredi in order to win their votes is in favor of this decision. And I agree that there are many in the Knesset, in Israeli society, that are willing to accommodate this importance of studying Torah, of the different values of Haredim, and they are willing to accept, even among the Knesset members, to accept the idea that Haredi's service draft should be different than non-Haredi draft. This is not a dichotomy between whether you can allow anything or not allow anything. The idea is that what type of decision is made by the Knesset, whether it is a rational-based decision or not. And I agree that this is a question about the role of the judiciary. But it is not a question about who decides whether the draft will be universal or not. It is not the court to decide it. And the court does not argue that it is its decision. The court simply argues about the process, the way that this kind of a decision is made. And I think that the issue is what do we mean by democracy? And in democracy, we do not mean that we exploit our power. And just to refer to what Ron has said earlier, I don't think that there is large majority that supports this unequal treatment. There isn't any large majority in favor of it. We see that even in this Knesset, they do not have the majority. Even this current coalition, they do not bring to vote any draft of the law. They couldn't even decide in the government, in the cabinet, about the proposal that they will. Well, they did in 2015. There was this Shaked committee. Ayelet Shaked and Yair Lapid drafted a law that was supposed to come into effect, but before it came into effect, the government changed, the Haredim returned to the coalition, and they changed the law, and this is the law that was repealed by the court. It's not that if the court had to review the law that was enacted by Lapid and Shaked, which was very balanced, it was far from universal draft, I believe that this law would not be struck down.
Hi. Hello. I'm just wondering if we put this back to the Knesset and the members of the Knesset, the various parties would decide that this is a very important value that we have to vote over, and they wouldn't have this power struggle, and they would make a unity government between the Likud and the middle, the left, center left, and you would have 70 people voting against the Haredim, saying they have to serve in the army. What would the answer of the Haredim be at that point? If they would have 70, 80 members of Knesset voting for... Yeah.
You were the closest.
Yeah, this one's good. So I can tell you a little bit from my personal experience. I was in my, I wouldn't say my youth, but it was about 10 years ago. I was an intern at Israel's Supreme Court. And this was 2014. And there was a Supreme Court decision that was given concerning the draft law, and there was a perceived threat that everybody would be all the Haredim would be drafted. It was a perceived threat because it wasn't a realistic threat. But even that was enough to draw huge crowds of Haredim, hundreds of thousands. The Haredim like to call hundreds of thousands, it's a million. It wasn't a million, but it was a lot of people. And all of a sudden, I was at the Supreme Court with my colleagues, and we were looking out the window like a sea of black. All the streets had been painted black. It was amazing, and so we all descended to go outside and to experience this. Not just me, all the interns, everyone went outside because it was such a remarkable thing to have outside your front door. And for me, I just remember this as a real moment because, I was on the one hand, I was like an intern at the court. So the demonstration was like against the court and I was working there. But on the other hand, these were like my neighbors. These were like the guys I daven with in shul. So like, where do I go here? It was such a moment. But what can I say from that experience is that that's the type of thing you would expect, meaning a mass demonstration. Now, the demonstration is nothing more than a show of power, right? It's a show of strength. It's a show of strength. It's a show of unity, right? It's a demonstration that we all follow certain rabbinic guidelines, or whatever it is. And that show of strength is enough to tell me that, we're not going to put hundreds of thousands of Haredim into prison for being draft dodgers, meaning it's not going to happen in a way that will be complete coercion. There's going to be, we're going to have something more nuanced than that. From what I'm hearing today, from Haredi parliamentary advisors, people involved in Haredi politics, there's a lot more readiness for compromise than ever before. And the question is, to what degree will that 70 Knesset member decision reflect a workable compromise, or to what degree will it be something which is, a kind of all or nothing solution that will just bring the Haredim to the street and create, we all remember the Emmanuel episode. I don't know if you remember it, which was, it was the decision, it was a much less controversial issue than the draft. And even there, the Haredim went to prison for it, So what we have to be aware of the, the social dynamic that's at play. And I think Knesset members are, I hope, intelligent enough and nuanced enough and self-aware enough to employ power in an aware way that will be able to bring about a good solution to this issue.
Can I just refer to your question also? Sorry.
Sure.
That there is a supermajority that wants this. How would they emotionally fight that?
I think that today everybody knows there's a supermajority. I think that today it's very, very clear that even Haredi fans, even whether it's politicians, whether it's social media, celebrities, and whether it's religious Zionist rabbis who are Haredi fans, they like the Haredim. And the Haredim have a lot going for them, and I think Haredim can make very positive contributions, as was mentioned before, to general society. Everybody is weighing in and saying, guys, you've got to, be a part of it. Whether they're using the language of equality, whether they're using the language of brotherhood, whether they're using the language of milchemes mitzvah, whatever the language is, I think it's very clear that there's a supermajority now that is, whether demanding or requesting or praying, that the Haredim will join. And I think it's making a difference. But between making a difference and between lining up at the bakum, at the recruitment centers to, please allow us in, there's a difference. So the last recruitment saw a real spike. But it was a spike from 200 to 400. It wasn't a spike from 200 to 2,000. So there's a way to go.
Just very quickly. First of all, I think that your hypothetical is very realistic. It may well happen within the next coming years. Secondly, I think that some of them would enlist, especially the Sephardim, which are about a third of the current Haredic population, and most of them weren't Haredim only a generation ago, in our generation. So they may well enlist. The other 2/3, I think, wouldn't be drafted, but they might suffer, let's call it in the right word, poverty, because the scenario that you describe would eventually lead, at least in the transition period, to even the starvation of children.
All right, we have 2 more questions in the room right now, and then we're waiting. Well, 3 more questions in the room right now, and then we may have to call the event. For now.
I have a question for Professor Medina. As a former student of yours in a constitutional law class, I'm wondering about what you were saying about how some of your colleagues on the far left are worried about the kind of accommodations that would need to be made in the army for if there was an influx of Haredim. And I was just wondering if indeed there is an influx of Haredim into the army, and it was agreed to make serious accommodations that really compromise liberal principles, first and foremost, gender equality, as to whether there is a chance that such an accommodation would survive a constitutional review, especially considering former decisions such as the Alice Miller decision and kind of the direction that the Supreme Court has taken. I wonder how such an accommodation would be seen to be proportional and to survive that kind of review.
Just you all had the right idea. My more learned and experienced colleagues, as Oren pashut na'avir kan. All right, this is the time. If you have a question, throw it in.
Okay, so I'll address my question to Rabbi Pfeffer. So when I speak to Haredim, it seems like the main concern is not just the Limud HaTorah, especially when you discuss a lot of the population which is just enrolled in yeshivot, but not necessarily the Gedolim of the next generation. The main concern seems to be how they're going to stay religious, and the main claim they make is to look at much of the Tzibur Dati Leumi, when there's a lot of Datlashtiyut, a lot of Chuzrim B'She'ela, and they mention how in their own community, the more people open up to whether it's university, whether it's the army, or just general Israeli society, they don't know how to handle it, they don't know how to integrate that with their religious life, and they end up going after society or whatever it is. So what exactly is your claim? Like, you think that the state's going to be more accommodating and that's going to help the Haredim adjust, or will the Haredim be able to make some sort of adjustment by themselves? Do you think Haredim would have a harder time spiritually, let's say, than the Tzibur Dati Leumi? Like, what's your opinion on this?
There's actually many ways to approach this problem, especially considering that Haredim are very diehard. I grew up in the Haredi community. They would give up their lives for this. I'm saying literally some of them would die. I'm not joking. It's really impossible to enforce. There's another approach that it's not popular, but not because it's not true, but because people are simply not aware, and it just doesn't feel good. And that is the consideration of the professional army. People think that October 7th has disproven it. That is really showing that people just haven't explored it, because the reality is that there's always been there's going to be a question at the end of this. The reality has been that there's always been a deficit of fighting soldiers and a surplus of non-fighting soldiers. Yet the popular feeling is, as long as Haredim are doing some role, which would actually drain more resources, because we don't need them there. We need fighting soldiers. So I feel like, even though democratically we could say that Haredim should be in the army, but they could make, obviously disingenuous because it's favoring their side, they could say, well, really there should be a professional army. It's a little bit like, imagine they would force a draft in the US where they don't need it. People could say, I'm not going to respect that because it's not necessary and therefore not democratic.
We're going to need to bring the question to a close.
Right. So, well, I need to bring all those facts in. So how does this argument reflect the legal side of it, seeing as he can make such an argument?
Okay, and then we also have one last question coming in online from a viewer in the UK. He says, the Equality Act in the UK protects the rights of minorities, promoting inequality for them. Inequality in quotes. Why can't this be applied to the Haredim? And he explains that this law of equality has also a law that provides certain minorities a protected characteristics, kind of equitable arrangements. And that is the final question. So all four of those, let's see what we can do.
Just address the question about gender equality in the army. I think that thanks. I think that it is more likely than not that an arrangement that accommodates the needs of ultra-Orthodox in the army would be permissible, in the sense that it's not like Miller type of a case in which women cannot serve in certain positions, period, but there are certain units in which women cannot serve. And I think that the equivalent is the academic campuses, which are separate between men and women, such that women can study in mixed campuses and regular campuses, but there is also this alternative. And if there is this purpose of bringing greater equality, enabling ultra-Orthodox to serve and things like that, I believe that this would be permissible. And again, we don't have to speculate, because already now there are even bases in the army that women are not allowed to enter into the bases. If there is this Ktinat Tash that comes to give some service to a soldier there, he should come out to the gate and speak to her outside. I think it's very problematic. It's challenging, but taking into consideration all aspects, it might be something that we should be. It's the lesser evil of the alternatives. Yeah.
And this relates to your question as well. Yeah, I'm just connecting the two questions because you said that the main concern is the ability to preserve the Haredi lifestyle, and yes, there are very delicate balances that would have to be taken care of for this purpose.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. It's a good question, and I would just say the following: two very important points. First of all, where the need is deep enough, and when we internalize the need, then of course we do things, even Haredim, that involve a certain exposure and involve a certain risk. If you have to raise money for the wedding of your children, you'll go to New York, Gewalt, and you'll go around the streets and you'll leave, Mea Sharim. Or when you need an income, then you'll go to work and you'll work in Intel and Mobileye and Amdocs and Facebook and so on. And even though the atmosphere there is not very yeshivish, it's in fact quite un-yeshivish. It's very woke, to work in Google. But we'll do it if you need an income. And if you internalize deep enough that this is something which we have to do because we're a part of the Jewish people and this is our responsibility, then even if it involves certain risk, then you'll still do it. It's a question of what's on the other side of the scales. That's one point. And the second point is that the army, certainly today, wasn't always the case, but certainly today, you look at the recent proposal of General Shkedi and others, the army is ready to make real concessions because today the army has very much internalized the dramatic need for Haredim to serve in the IDF, and they're ready to make a lot of concessions. And the comparison with religious Zionist society, first of all, today, it's not the same as it was 30 years ago, also for religious Zionists. The level of secularization, of the Tlashiot and so on, is not the same. You have these wonderful Talmidei Chachamim, serving in the IDF, and they're an example to all of us. That's number one. But number two, it's not the same playing field. The Haredim come from a different mindset. They come from, now some say, well, because you've been more isolated, it's going to be harder for you. But there's also the other side of that coin, that Haredim come from a very strong and very cohesive and very, I would say, different kind of background to your religious Zionist soldier who's much more a part of broader Israel, who's much more integrated culturally and in a value sense and so on. So it's not really a fair comparison. And I think insofar as we internalize the need and the duty and the responsibility, then it's up to us to make it work. And I think we can. But it just requires that internal drive. And I think there's changes that are happening to Ron's and others' questions. It's true that Haredi society is not uniform. There's different parts of it, and each part has its own ideology and reaction and so on. But each part also has a lot of influence over the others. And I certainly think there's a lot to be hopeful about, even though right now we are in a challenging situation. Oh, the English. Anyone familiar with English law? Chok Habriti, equality law? Now, without deep familiarity, it's probably not the same. The Haredim are, a large percentage and growing, and to exempt them as a kind of, small minority is a big deal.
Okay, my friends, we're on time for a Jewish event. So, a big hand for our speakers. Thank you to Professor Medina, Professor Shapira, and Rabbi Pfeffer.